Hey guys, so I am going to do Revelation with you. I think we're going to have to do it over 2 weeks because, well, it's a big book, and also the reason why we want to do it is obviously it's quite intimidating. I'm I'm not particularly one for studying Revelation, to be honest. It's one of those things that you see some people are like make everything in the news about the beast or dragons or whatever, and then and then so yeah, and I think that's a load of nonsense because I never really think that that's how you should read the Bible. But anyway, I have 12 in my notes and I've got 2 weeks worth. So yes, I'm going to do it. So basically, introduction, I'm going to just go over the author, the date and the destination of the book of Revelation. I'm just going to just quickly go over the schools of interpretation, so how people interpret it and which ones are better than others. Go over the genre, and then also how to interpret the book. And so next week we'll go over the content and the main themes. All right, so this is just preparing to actually get in there. So author is John. They don't know exactly which John, to be honest. So I again, those kind of little details are things that don't really interest me, to be honest. But it's John. And according to scholarship, he was Aramaic Jew. And so he was very familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. So this is really something that we just hold on to, that Revelation is very ingrained with the Old Testament symbolism. Apparently not written very well, say, for example, like Hebrews is better written, just language-wise, as in other words, I suppose maybe they're saying this person's not an intellectual or whatever. So the date of the book, well, there is some debate about this, but my notes are saying it's around 96 AD, so that's the ruler I can't pronounce his name, Domitian or whatever. Anyway, Roman rule wasn't he was, yeah. And it was more localized persecution at this time rather than empire-wide persecution, which we've mentioned before. And the destination of the letters, well, there's 7 churches mentioned. So it's either they're the main churches or they're representative of specific issues. And they're representing churches. They obviously have those issues, but it's also whether they're just sent to them or whether they represent those issues. The 4 main schools of interpretation. So you got I can never pronounce this. A pre-terrorist view. I've noticed this view is becoming more and more popular. Actually, it's something I don't agree with, but. Basically, they say that the book of Revelation, all the prophecies in there, fully fulfilled, all done, job done. And they use the fall of Jerusalem 69 AD as their sort of justification for that, I guess. That kind of idea, I suppose, was really relevant for the audience at the time. However, the problem with this view is that Satan and the cosmic evil powers haven't been totally overthrown. We know that. And also, at the end of the day, we're not living in a new heaven and a new earth. And this is things that are said in Revelation. So I have actually recommended this book before. And I think I said that I don't agree with his eschatology, his ideas of the end times and how we see that being fulfilled. However, the book is Dr. Jonathan Welton, and he wrote a book called Raptureless. You get free off the internet. But I really like what he did, and what I read was he was comparing what happened in Revelation to what happened in the fall of Jerusalem. And I think that's not wrong. I think, this is to a certain extent. I just don't agree with that then, therefore, we don't, Revelation's been fulfilled. So that's the pre-terrorist view. Historicist view. So Revelation foretells history from the first century till now. The only issue with this is that a lot of people that have this, I don't know why it's called horoscope. Yeah, anyway, focuses mainly on the present and on the West. However, we know that the church isn't just the West. So whatever happens in the West doesn't say, oh, well, that's what, the prophecy's being fulfilled, because, it's like, well, actually the West is not the only church, is not just the church is worldwide. And also a lot of the time what they do is they read signs from and symbols that are in Revelation without regards to the first century understanding. So we're talking about context here, and I say it further on in the notes, but you can't read the symbols out of context. So first of all, so when we talked about context, interpretation, then application, so you need to, when you read the scriptures, so you need the context of obviously what's going on there and then the symbols you need to have, they need to make sense to the people that were written to. If you're saying something weird about microchips in arms or whatever, and that's the interpretation, that's what that means. It didn't mean anything back then. This is what it truly means. For example, well, at first, that's totally alien. However, sorry to go on. However, a better way of doing it, if you wanted to talk about microchips, is you see the context in the persecuted church not being able to go and buy food, for example, unless they give a sacrifice or burn incense to a statue, a Nero, an emperor, or the gods. And if you did that, you got a stamp on your hand, and then you could go and buy food, for example. And you could say, well, that if it came to being that we all had to have cards, and we couldn't go buy food with our cards unless we gave some kind of ritualistic sacrifice and said there's no other God but Allah, say, example, or there's no God. We had to demand there's no God. And if you did that, then you got a stamp, or you got microchip, say, then you could say, okay, well, as long as you put it in the context of the past, and then you bring it into the application of today. However, just to say, oh, well, a mark of a beast, and now we're having microchips in our hands, so that's it's like, well, no, because you've taken it out of context then. You've got to have the context of what the mark of the beast actually was back then to then be able to apply it to today, if that makes sense. So that's what a lot of these kind of people do. They don't read it in context. They just read it out of context and put their meaning on that. And it happens all the time. I hear people do this all the time. Take scriptures and take things out of context and make them what they want to make them. And that's not good biblical reading. So that's kind of that view. And then a futurist, so it's dispensationalism. Basically, they say chapter 1's the early church, chapter 2 and 3 is the whole of history, and then chapter 4 to 22 is basically the last 7 years of tribulation before the end. The only problem is that we know that the last days have already begun, and so therefore it makes 80% of the revelation irrelevant for the church today, because you're basically saying, well, we're not doing 4 to 22 yet until this 7 years. And this, again, just doesn't take the reading of this genre that we'll talk about in a bit seriously. Then you've got the idealist view. So they kind of, I think this is quite similar to the pre-tourist view, except, not quite saying it's fully fulfilled now, already been. But it follows the symbolism correctly and recognises a revelation has a universal application, but it recognises God's actions through history as defeating evil, but taken to extreme, there is no need of Jesus to come back again. So, yeah, just this idea that God is slowly defeating evil through us. And, eventually, I guess if we talk, in our language, used to language, therefore we'll have a fully realised heaven on earth experience. Only issue is we've been here 2,000 years and that hasn't happened. It's nowhere near happening. Although God has done a lot through the working of his people by the Spirit. So he has done a lot, but yeah, we're not going to be fully realised, I'm afraid. So genre. So there's 3 genres in the book. It's apocalyptic, prophecy, and it's a letter. So apocalyptic was a popular style of writing, especially in times of suffering and hardship. And this is not just the New Testament, I'm talking about Old Testament, like Jewish and probably non-Jewish as well, I would have thought. but this idea is like the times of suffering and hardship, but encourages the faithful that God will have victory in the end. So the key characteristics: symbolic language, drawn from scripture and the time it's written. So not just the Old Testament scriptures, but Greek, Romany symbolism as well. And the imagery is supposed to conjure up images to inspire, but not to be taken literally. Now, kind of, it was literal, but kind of what we could do nowadays is if we showed someone the Nazi flag, like that would conjure up images. Like we don't need to say anything. We could just show a Nazi flag and that would, most people, well, in the West anyway, would recognise that symbol and they could explain what that symbol meant in certain ways. And then you've got visions and the heavenly journey reveals there's more going on behind the scene than what we see. So there's suffering, for example, on part of the journey, in a person's journey, but heaven's view sees that differently. So don't be deceived by appearances. That's what it's trying to say. However, this New Testament apocalypse is unlike older documents. We know that the Spirit of God, John teaches the Spirit of God is present with his people. And, John makes that known, that Jesus, he makes Jesus known, in other words, it's not a hidden reality like it was before, that actually the seal has been opened and it wasn't for the coming time, it's for now. Jesus is for now. If that makes sense. And then you've got prophecy. So in the Old Testament, the main concern God was dealing with his people was there and then, and only a tiny proportion of prophecies were actually dealing with the distant future. So the Revelation is kind of dealing with that in a similar way. The Old Testament prophecies were conducted. This is a book about the now and how Jesus has already begun through God's intervention into the world. Although the complete fulfillment has not come yet. The Spirit of God has been poured out on his people, as we know in Acts. And also Revelation is not really concerned with minor details. And then it's a letter. It's a letter that arises out of current situations to address specific needs in the church. So also deals with current situations to prepare the 7 churches as well for what's to come. Revelation, therefore, is a prophetic apocalyptic letter. So we've done genre and now historical setting for sort of the context. So we've talked about some of this before in other parts, but mentioned it before, but social tensions have arisen. There's local persecution happening to the churches due to the imperial cult, which the Christians are rejecting. In other words, not bowing down and worshipping the emperor or the gods. And also a lot of workplaces were connected to idolatry. So if you think about like workers' unions, you kind of had to be in a workers' union, like a guild, certain jobs. And I guess that in this guild, you had to pledge allegiance to, I guess, either the emperor or probably to local gods, more likely. And then when you refused, when you refused to bow down to God's given incense or give a sacrifice, then that would be an affront to the local gods. And then the people would probably be concerned with the local god, would take it out on them. And so this would bring tensions and hostility to the Christians. And then you've got local Jews who started to want to get their heads down, distance themselves from Christians, and kind of denounce Christians as non-Jews. And so Christians had no legal standing as they were not considered Jews. The thing is, we always say the Roman Empire like really mean to the Jews, but that's not true actually. If you if you had a heritage in your religion, that kind of almost like proved that it was legit. So the Jews could say, look, we've got thousands of years worth, and we've got our scriptures, we can prove ourselves. We don't know who these Christians are, they can't prove themselves, we're not saying we're part of them. And so they were just like this new thing, and new was never considered good in Hellenistic culture, Roman Greco culture. New was not good, change was not good. That was always a thing. Change was not good. So depending on where you lived, you could be, you could be living in hardship, struggle to get work, and people being hostile to you, and also being, totally persecuted and suffering and dying. And suffering was happening, but in Revelation is teaching that it will get worse for those who will not worship the beast. So Rome is considered like the powers, and the Roman Church are destined to be in a battle. And it's also predicted, Revelation is also predicting internal struggles within the church. And Revelation is also teaching that local rulers, so rulers of the earth, will appear to win at first, and things will get worse before they get better, and suffering and death will lie ahead. However, like Revelation is trying to encourage the people of God trying to encourage the people that God is in control and will bring them into eternal rest, and warn them not to abandon Christ, because to abandon Christ is to be swept away with Rome and their ultimate judgment. So how to interpret Revelation? When reading Revelation, it's important that we know the significance of each symbol in that was used, whether it's from the HRL, whether it's Jewish or Greco-Roman. When working out what the symbol means, like I said earlier, the rule that we need to abide by is that the original readers would have understood it, and then only can we interpret it to have implications for the modern day readers. We are to treat the visions as a whole. So, for example, the woman clothed in the sun, the crown of 12 stars and standing on the moon picks up from Joseph's vision in Genesis 7 and represents Israel. So you can go read that and just look at the comparisons. Revelation is heavily influenced by the Old Testament, more than any book in the Bible, New Testament. So kinds of symbols that we'll see. Themes. So constant standard biblical images. So Babylon has always been known as, especially in the Old Testament, it was always known as the world city that was under God's judgment. Now Babylon in Revelation is being replaced by Rome. When it talks about Rome, it's about God's judgment. And other symbols such as the horse equals power, authority. And we actually discussed that in the Joshua and the violence, about how God talks about hamstringing the horses. They are a symbol, of power and authority. Some symbols have multiple meanings depending on the context. I haven't given an example there, but and then there's also cultural themes. So scrolls that we see, the 7 scrolls, who will eventually inherit the earth. Actually, the scrolls are a cultural symbol of the legal last will and testament. That's what they would have used in the Roman world. They would have used scrolls, so people were understanding that that's a legal document, that God is giving a legal document that's bound. They're bound by it. Old Testament symbols, so 1,000 years, that we have the 1,000-year periods, is that a period of difficulty that we see in Revelation, is actually an unknown period. It's not a literal 1,000 years. We look at Psalms 90-4, which I can't remember what that is, but it's not. And then the 1,000, and then also there's the other scripture, I don't know where it is. It's like 1,000 years. It's like what is it? A year, and a year is like 1,000, whatever. Basically, it's just an unknown period. It's an unknown period, and it's just saying that there's going to be a difficulty there. And the plagues that come up, that's a symbol of God's first exodus and judgment on Egypt. Then you have things like numbers and colours. So white equals holiness, red equals bloodshed, gold equals heaven, heavenly. And then finally, we've got some symbols are just unclear, not quite sure. They could be this or that. I haven't done an example, but there's a couple like that, a few like that. So with studying the symbolism and meaning of Revelation, the best place to start is the images that John explains. So those can provide larger context to the lesser certain symbols that we use. So, for example, the Son of Man, we know, is Jesus, and that's used in the Gospels. It's also harking back to Daniel 7, and talking about the leader, the person who is like the Son of Man. Um, then you've got things like the golden lampstands, which are 7 churches. The 7 stars are their messengers. We've got the great dragon, which is the Satan, the evil powers. You've got Rome, it's the great harlot, and the 7 hills, the seven heads. Yeah, so that's basically it. That wasn't too long, was it? Too painful. But I'll go over, maybe the next one might be a little bit longer, but trying to really like not make it bogged down. I hope that helps. So yeah, that's week 1. Next week we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk about the content and the main themes.